All right. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny Budinsky. I am your host for today's exciting program. Now, in Standing for Truth, we defend the truth of biblical creation. We also host some awesome guests here on the program as we seek to defend creation and refute evolution. That is exactly what we are going to be doing here today with Dr. Grady McMurtry. And as always, I am thrilled to have Dr. Grady with me. He is an encyclopedia worth of information. I feel like we're just getting started, Dr. Grady. As I mentioned in the pre-show, you've been here many, many times. We've done numerous of our 2-hour Q&A sessions, and I feel like I could ask you questions until the second coming, as long as the second coming is sometime today, brother. And so you are also a fan favorite. And I know our audience is very enthusiastic today about getting their questions answered. Now, before we get into our defense of biblical creation and our debunking of evolution and an old earth, I do want to give my guest here, Dr. Grady S. McMurtry, a formal introduction. Dr. Grady S. McMurtry is an American Christian apologist who focuses on the areas of biblical scientific creationism and creation science. Dr. McMurtry earned his BS from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, an MS from the State University of New York, Syracuse, with honors, from my understanding as well, and a DD from the School of Theology, Columbus, Georgia. He was previously a Regent and Adjunct Professor of the School of Theology, Columbus, Georgia, life member of the Creation Research Society, and a lifetime member of the Mensa Society and Intertel. McMurtry was an evolutionist for 20 years, a theistic evolutionist for 1.5 years, and has been a biblical scientific creationist for over 49 years. He has made hundreds of appearances on radio and television, lectured in universities, colleges, and schools, and has spoken in churches worldwide. In addition, Dr. McMurtry is on the recommended speaker lists of national, educational, and ministerial organizations. Lastly, he is the author of many articles, magazine, and newspaper articles in the United States and abroad. So in other words, Dr. Grady, you're more than qualified to speak on the topics that we are going to be engaging today in our program. So Dr. Grady, thanks again, as always, for your time. I know how busy you are. And since the last time you've been here, how have you been, brother?
Been good. And we can add books as well.
You've done it all, Dr. Grady.
Well, I'm still working on that. But I was going to say, it might be the Canadian accent. I'm not sure, but
it could.
But I was an adjunct, not a junk.
Oh, okay. Us Canadians, I tell you, there's no helping us.
I thought that was funny. But no, I mean, this last month I was 3 weeks down in Paraguay, Bolivia, and Brazil teaching on creation science. It was my 20th year in Brazil, second year in Bolivia, my first year in Paraguay. But I teach on continents all over the world, of 5 so far. If I can just get one invitation to Antarctica, if anybody can figure that one out, I'd be happy to go. But
then officially you would have gone everywhere on the planet.
I've covered a lot of it.
Close to. And so Brazil, how's the reception over there with creation science and Christian apologetics?
Well, it's good, certainly. But that's in the Protestant churches, which are on the rise. Mm-hmm. Brazil is a country that's coming out of a lot of animism, voodoo, of course, Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, has been there for basically 500 years. And of course, they had slavery into the 1800s, until the late 1800s. So there's a real mixed bag there, but Protestant Christianity is definitely on the rise. The unfortunate news, of course, is that so is communism. Bolivia is a communist country. Paraguay isn't there yet, fortunately.
Well, they're blessed to have you there over the course of the last little while to evangelize and to minister, Dr. Grady. So again, I appreciate your time, and we've got a lot to get through today, and I'm excited because, as I said earlier, you're well-rounded on these topics. You can answer questions just about on every single topic. So as I begin to set the foundation for today's show, Christian Apologist Debunks Evolution, Why Biblical Creation is True is what I've titled it. And our audience, this is going to give you the opportunity to send in your questions, your objections, or challenges. If you're a critic, we do these live for you. So feel free to start sending those in. And in the meantime, Dr. Grady, what I'd like to do is begin this discussion by setting the foundation for many of the questions that we will be engaging throughout this program. And so, Dr. Grady, what is the Bible? The Bible being our final authority, what does the Bible have to say about this issue of origins? Is evolution and an old earth consistent with the Bible? Can these ideas be fit into the scriptures? Or is the Bible very clear about ancestry and the age of the earth?
Well, first of all, I would point out that we do defend creation from a biblical standpoint, obviously. Then, as you say, that is our first authority. But we also defend it scientifically, too. There's ample science to prove that the earth and the universe are young, exactly as the Bible says. So the Bible claims that God created everything in 6 literal 24-hour type of days that we experience today, and approximately 6,000 years ago. The genealogy on that, of course, is the genealogy of Mary. When we go to Luke, Luke starts with Mary's father, goes back through King David, goes all the way back to Adam, the son of God. And so that genealogy is basically 6,000 years. And so the genealogies are there in the Bible. The written history, it is the oldest accurate history book in the world. Accurate histories outside of the Bible were not really being kept until roughly the time of Herodotus. Even though there are some people who would claim that the various ancient civilizations had an older starting point, it's not true. Those histories are simply corrupted verbal histories of what happened when the people came out of the ark and started to spread around the world. So from a biblical standpoint, there's no question about the approximate age of the earth at 6,000, give or take a little. I hope that we are not going to, argue over 20 years or something like that. And the genealogies are there. The history is there. It's a contiguous historical writing with the insertion of various wisdom books, that sort of thing. And scientifically, we take a look at geochronometers, which is, I think, one of the most fascinating fields of scientific study to debunk the millions and billions of years. You have to remember that evolution is a religion. It has its tenets, just as Christianity does. And one of the tenets of the religion of evolution, or more officially, secular humanism, is that you must believe in millions and billions of years. You must believe that by fortuitous accidents called mutations, that things supposedly get bigger, better, faster, smarter. But in science, we take a look at genetics and we can see that things are getting smaller, slower, and dumber. So science contradicts evolution. It does not support evolution.
Very good, Dr. Grady. Amen. And so what I'd like to ask you is regarding the Hebrew word for day, which is yom, if I'm not mistaken. And so many in the old earth creation and the theistic evolutionist camp, they will argue that there are multiple meanings of this Hebrew word yom, and that day can mean a long period of time, and thus basically arguing that the young earth creation interpretation of Genesis is not necessary. What's a good response to that?
Well, there are many very good responses. First of all, yom is the most common word for day in Hebrew, and it is used 2,301 times in the Old Testament. I think that's enough to figure out the meaning. However, it cannot mean millions and billions of supposed years with an indefinite beginning and an indefinite end. It can be used historically and it can be used prophetically. But in those uses, it is things like the day of the Lord, the day of Jacob's trouble. We could say in my father's day. But these are specific times, not necessarily one specific day. I mean, my father lived over 60 years, but we still refer to in my father's day as a very specific period that only lasted a short amount of time in terms of humans. And so it can be used that way. Now, in my first book on creation, to me, this was such an important question. You know, what did day mean in Genesis chapter 1? I actually copied every single possible use of the word yom from the two largest Hebrew lexicons available, all of them, filled 4 pages of my book, but it can never mean millions and billions of years. It can never mean these epochs, eons, eras with indefinite beginnings and indefinite ends. It always refers to something much more specific. I would also point out that when you use numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, the natural reading is just 1 day of 24 hours, 2 days, 3 days, 24 hours. We have biblical references, such as Jesus says that Adam and Eve were there at the beginning. Jesus says, since the foundation of the world, the blood of all the prophets that have been shed. He's talking about a creation 6,000 years ago. He's not talking about millions or billions of years ago. But I think the single best defense of the word yom, from a biblical standpoint, outside of the book of Genesis, would be in Exodus chapter 20. This is where God is giving Moses the 10 Commandments. And you'll note, I think, that giving the 10 Commandments, certainly one of the most important historical moments in human history, whether you believe in the Bible or not, certainly equal to or greater than some other historical events. That God stops in the middle of giving the 10 Commandments, and he inserts Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11, and he says, you shall work 6 days and rest one because I did. And he equates the days of creation and the days that he used to create to the human days. And so he equates them. These are not millions or billions of years, that they are 24-hour periods, one rotation of the earth. And he gives it to us as a template to live our lives. I don't know how much you're aware of the French Revolution, though I know that you have a French-speaking community. But if you'll take a look at the French Revolution, when Napoleon came to power and they developed the metric system, which you are certainly very familiar with, but doing everything in tens, they said, well, we are starting with an evolutionary worldview. We are not starting with a biblical worldview, and therefore we're going to also have a week of 10 days. But while the metric system, flawed as it is, has been maintained, the 10-day week didn't work because everybody knew that wasn't right. And so while they tried to enforce it, the people simply went back to a 7-day week because everybody knew that was the right amount.
That's very interesting right there, Dr. Grady. You made several interesting points, actually. You started it off. So the word day or yom, the underlying word for day, is used 2,301 times.
Correct.
You said?
In the Old Testament. Yes, sir.
So like you said, that's a good amount of times for us to figure out what it means in the various contexts that it's used.
It is in no way obscure.
Yeah, there's no way is it obscure. And so I'm wondering, is it accurate to say that the word yom is tightly constrained in Genesis because it is used specifically as either the light portion of a day or a 24-hour day, but never used as a long period of time?
Well, and again, we can take a look at it's one rotation, one period of darkness, one period of light. The Jewish day begins in darkness. It doesn't. The date in the Jewish calendar does not change at midnight the way you and I do it. The date changes 90 minutes after sunset. And the reason for that is because in Genesis, God says the day starts in darkness. And of course, there is a biblical typology here too. Many people don't think about it, but just the simple rotation of the earth teaches a spiritual truth. That when we get here, when you are born, you start in darkness. But if you come to know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, you will end in light. And there's many other allusions to light. Of course, Jesus, the light of the world, and so on. But God says and defines each day as one rotation, one period of darkness, one period of light, one rotation. I'm not covering all of the arguments, but they're more than enough to define it as a standard day of roughly 24 hours.
I think it is in Genesis 2, Dr. Grady, where, and a lot of old earth creationist apologists will argue this way, like at Reasons to Believe being one of them. And it's in Genesis 2 where it talks about in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And so they'll try and equate that with, well, in my grandfather's day or my parents' day. So it's not necessarily one single day. It's just that generation. Dr. Grady, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think people are trying to force things that are not there. The obvious reading there is in the day that the Lord created the earth. Well, he did create the earth on day one.
Right.
And so that's factually true. And secondly, they're trying to make the same kind of thing that we do in all languages. All languages have their idioms and their idiomatic expressions and so forth, and this is no different. It's simply talking about the creation week, but he did create the earth on day one. I mean, that is an accurate statement. And there are other places in the Bible where we can prove again that this is a specific time. Now, again, it can be used in various ways. After all, if I filled four pages of my book with the different nuances, but again, none of them are allowed to mean epochs, eras, eons, etc.
That's a really good point you make. And so I kind of want to reiterate it. So basically you're saying Genesis 2:4 could be referring to the day, the first day that God created, because that's when God created the earth.
It can be a simple factual statement.
Yeah.
You have to remember that there is no two creations. Many people want to separate Genesis 1, chapter 1 from chapter 2 and following and say that these are different creation accounts. There's people who want to have the day age theory, the gap theory, allegory theory, framework theory. I mean, there's just all kinds of people who have these arguments primarily because they do not want to believe the Bible. At least
Right.
they do not want to believe that God is big enough to do all the things that he did on each of the 24-hour days. Now, I have come to the point, having studied this now for 50 years, have come to the point that why did he take so long? But it was, again, to give us a template for the way we're to live our lives. And so God did have a purpose. Now, if you think about the number 10 in the Bible, the number 10 is perfect spiritual completion. And if God had wanted a week of 10 days, he could have defined it that way, but he didn't. And I would also point out, again, the word Yom, and let's use it, for instance, the sixth feast of the Old Testament, the sixth major feast is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And so here you have another use where it's quite specific, and yet Yom Kippur occurs every year. So there have been, since the time of Moses and the implementation of the Mosaic laws, we've had these 7 major feasts, and there are various minor feasts that occur every single year. So I think, again, this is an argument proving that the people who want to try to not believe the creation account. Now, I think it's kind of silly now, but I was an evolutionist. I taught evolution. I believed it. And it took me 16 months to figure out whether God had used evolution to create or whether he had simply created it exactly as he narrates, because Genesis, chapter 1, chapter 2, are written in continuous Hebrew narrative, but they're also written in such a way as you have the skeleton of the creation week in Genesis 1:1 to the middle of 2:4, and then in the middle of 2:4, we start getting details of what occurred during the creation week. So it's not 2 creation accounts, it's 1 creation account, but God gives us the skeleton, and then he puts the meat on the bones. And so people, again, are misconstruing what is written in Hebrew because they're looking at perhaps just nothing more than an English translation. Well, if you lose something in a translation, you can mess up a lot of things. And when you do a translation, there are words often left out. And translators trying to give what they think is a more complete rendering will add words that should never be there. That's why you have italics in translations. The italics are for words that were never there, but inserted by the translators. But you can have words left out too. Primary one that I would illustrate is Genesis 2:7. God did not speak the body of Adam into existence. He made him from previously existing materials. He actually selected each and every atom out of the dust of the ground, and he constructed, made, formed is the correct version, the body of Adam, but it wasn't alive. And then he blows the breath of life, the soul, the what is the Hebrew word nefesh, into the body, and it becomes alive. And most English translations, and he became a living being. But it leaves out a word. It leaves out human, because Adam was a human being, and this is when God places the spirit inside the body of Adam. And so he is a triune being. With God made the body, God made it alive with the soul, and then he placed a spirit inside the body. And Adam was a triune being, the same reason we are triune beings, and we reflect the triune nature of our God.
Again, a lot of excellent points in that response, Dr. Grady. And so I like your illustration there about Genesis 1, Genesis 2, because we see the skeptics as well. You're atheist, you're evolutionist. They'll say, oh, there's contradictory accounts there. That's a contradiction because you're looking at two different creation stories. But like you said, and hopefully I reiterate it accurately, that we're looking at the skeleton. Then once you get to Genesis 2, you're getting the meat on the bones there, the details.
Donny, God is a perfect author. Would you agree?
Amen. Amen, brother.
Now, again, another analogy to this is when you read a technical paper, whether it's in economics, science, social studies, how do you write a technical paper? Well, the first thing is you have a title,
right,
and then you have an abstract. I mean, every scientific article and others that are in technical journals, magazines, will do this. They have the title of the article, they have the abstract, which is the skeleton of the article and what they're going to prove or claim. And then you have the article. And God wrote the Bible in exactly the same way. Genesis 1:1 to 2:4a is the abstract. And then from 2:4b continuing, we then take the starting of the article and continue, that we fill in the details.
Yeah, that's great, Dr. Grady. I appreciate that. And so there's no contradiction at all. It makes sense. I like your analogy with your technical papers. You've got the abstract that you can read a summary, then you got to go into the actual paper for the details.
Well,
and so
the marriage ceremony and making Eve and all that takes place on day 6.
Right.
It didn't happen after the creation week. It happened on day 6, but it's revealed to us in chapter 2. So God gives us the quick skeleton, chapter 1, into, again, the first half of verse 4 in chapter 2. And then he fills in details. And I mean, again, chapter 3 begins with the beginning of sin, and it is, again, something that would happen immediately after the creation week.
Because there are some in the theistic evolutionist camp, which I think you just refuted thoroughly, they'll say, well, Genesis 2 is a continuation of Genesis 1 in the sense that Genesis 1, God's creating humanity in general. And then Genesis 2, he's picking out a priest from humanity. So a greater group of people where you get Adam and Eve. And then that way they can argue, oh, these are the 2 first humans out of a population of hominins. But yet you're refuting that because no, it's not really a continuation. It's just more details of what's going on day 6.
And again, I would suggest that on the first 5 days of creation, God could have done everything that is listed for the first 5 days in the first second of each day and then waited. But day 6 definitely has sequential time. So this is a 24-hour period, and he did these various things during this 24 hours.
Right.
But the first 5 days don't require that.
So another argument that I'm sure you've heard more than enough times is when it comes to the very clear words of Jesus, where he says, from the beginning of creation, he made them male and female, which I think is very clearly pointing back to the creation week, speaking of Adam and Eve.
Yes, sir.
And so they'll say, well, Jesus isn't really declaring or saying anything about the age of the earth or the creation of man. He's just trying to make a point about marriage and divorce. And so we as young earth creationists, we're taking this too far to make any age of the earth conclusions. What's a good rebuttal to that, Dr. Grady?
Well, I think you ought to believe Jesus. He is God in the first place. But think about Romans 5:12, when Paul talks about the origination of sin and death of a nephesh organism. But let's go to Romans chapter 1, because Paul, again, writing, says, from the creation, God has always had a witness. Well, that witness has to be human. If we go to Isaiah chapter 45, we get a very similar thing, that God formed the earth to be inhabited. That's by people. He's not talking about plants and animals. Habitation can only be done by people. And so whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament, the prophets and the apostles clearly understood and clearly taught that the earth was young, and they have rendered to us what is easily understandable. You really have to invent arguments that are spurious to try to get to an old earth view.
Right. You really can't put in an already debunked theory. You call it a religion, evolution. What's the point of trying to force fit that into a perfectly good book that's never been disproven?
Well, and when you do that, you negate the cross.
Yeah, that's
Now,
right.
Again, I have stipulated this, I think, on every program we've had. I stipulate what you believe about the age of the earth is not the salvation issue. And I think you would agree. It is critical to the gospel, but it is not the salvation issue. And I want to make that very plain. So if you believe in an old earth, old universe, you could still go to heaven. That does not negate salvation. But when you do believe in that, you are still negating the power of the cross, whether you realize it or not. And I would like to give everybody the benefit of the doubt that you just don't understand the theological issues here. Because if the death of a nephesh organism occurred before Adam's sin, then that means that nephesh organisms, which means animals, maybe people, were living and dying before Adam's sin. If that is true, then Adam's sin is not the cause of death of nephesh organisms. But in Romans 5:12, Paul is very specific about this, also in 1 Corinthians as well, that it was the sin of the first man, Adam, who brought the death of nephesh organisms into the universe.
You mentioned earlier that Adam was created from pre-existing material, from the dirt of the ground.
Specifically the dust, which
Right.
is an accurate scientific statement. Every atom in your body is common in the dust of the earth.
That's right. That's an excellent point. And so many theistic evolutionists have run with these ideas, especially those in what's called the ancient Near Eastern camp. I think it is. And so they'll say, well, there's a consensus of scholars that would agree Genesis 1:1 isn't translated properly. So they'll say that it should be translated as when God began to create. And so then the follow-up argument is, well, this makes it dependent upon the earth being formless and void. And so it's not actually talking about the absolute beginning or creation ex nihilo. It's basically God now taking disorder and making order from that pre-existing material. Doctor, are you familiar with that argument, Dr. Grady? And what's a good way to respond?
Well, yeah, I'm familiar with the argument. Of course, this is a total misconstruct. It is a false translation, And I want to also stipulate that I'm not that concerned about a word-for-word translation. What I am concerned about is an interpretation by concept.
Right.
And so there's no perfect translation. You always lose something in the translation. I deal with this in all of my foreign work. Every country I go to that English is not the first language. But even one translation into English. But when I'm teaching, think about it. I'm speaking English and I'm in Paraguay, they speak Spanish, and we're talking about Greek or Hebrew in the Bible. That's a double translation. So, it can get pretty poor. And that's why I, again, stress I'm not so much concerned about a word-for-word translation, because you can get the wrong nuances. When I'm speaking, and as I am just to you, one word in the English language might have 10 different nuances. And when I use one of them, I might be using the second nuance in the English in an unabridged Oxford dictionary. But in the Spanish language, a good not translator, but a good interpreter, would realize the context of what I'm using that at, the nuance I'm trying to stress, and they would say, oh, well, that's not the first nuance direct translation, it's the sixth nuance. And a good interpreter will do that. But of course, while the Bible should always be thought of as inerrant, you just don't read it literally, because which language are you going to read it literally in? And because there's the bias of the translators, because in the ancient languages there are no punctuation marks. When people attempt to translate from the original documents, they may actually punctuate it incorrectly. I can show you several very good examples. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and 2 are the very first example of mispunctuation. But there's a great spot, for instance, say in John chapter 9. So punctuation can change the meaning. It can be done improperly, even if the word selection might be correct. And again, italicized words should be removed from the text because they were never there. They were added by the translators. And so you must divide the word accurately, okay? And the way to do that is by interpretation, not translation. But then there are the people who want to interpret it incorrectly. And for instance, they'll add a word. Oh, when God began to create. No, that's not what it says. First of all, the first word of the Hebrew Bible, Bereshit, actually means at the beginning, which is quite specific. In the beginning is nebulous. But the Bible actually starts with the Hebrew terminology of at the beginning. This is when God created time. The first verse of the Bible, the first line of the Bible. God creates time, God creates space, and God creates mass. This is exactly what a perfect scientist would do. It's called the time-space-mass continuum in the scientific realm. And so isn't it interesting that he actually uses the time-space-mass continuum as his opening statement?
Wow.
And he uses the verb that can only be used of God. It cannot be used of people with the root bara, which means to create where there was nothing previously existing. And when God speaks, time, space, mass come into existence because he is completely 100% sovereign, and he can literally speak these things into existence. That verb with the root bara cannot be used with people. The other two verbs that are used in the beginning of Genesis, which can be used with people, asa, meaning to assemble, and yatsar, to form, referring to simply the assembly of a car is from previous existing parts. Form is like a potter with clay. And actually, that's the term that's used in the making of the body of Adam. That you could, I'm not saying this is the correct translation, but you could render it that God collected the clay from the ground and, like a potter, formed the body of Adam. That would not be a misinterpretation. It wouldn't fit exactly with the translation, but it would fit with the concept.
Well, that's an excellent response, Dr. Grady. I think that thoroughly dismantles that argument, so I appreciate it. And so we've discussed the age of the earth, the meaning of the word yom, and whether or not these days in Genesis are ordinary days. I do want to get into the Genesis flood briefly, but we did get a question that came in here that's relevant to what we're discussing here, and it is a common one, so I appreciate this. Comes in from Redefine Living, and a question for you, obviously, Dr. Grady. And so he's saying some critics say that there was no earth and sun on the first couple of days, so therefore a day is mysterious. What do you have to say about that?
Well, there's nothing mysterious about it. First of all, God does not create the sun, moon, and stars until day 4. He doesn't create the objects that make light and reflect light until day 4. I understand the argument, okay? But verse 3, day 1, God speaks light into existence. The earth was actually created in darkness. There was no light. God didn't need light to see. And so when he creates light, verse 3, the earth is already rotating. That's in verse 2. And there's one period of darkness, one period of light, and then God says it's one day. Now, if God says it's a day, why can't you accept that? Secondly, on day 4, that light that God speaks into existence, because he is the light giver. Light surrounds the throne of God. It dispels darkness. There's all kinds of biblical typologies, but he defines each day as a day, one rotation of the earth. On the first 3 days, no different than the second 3 days. And if God calls it a day, it's a day. And he does say one period of darkness, one period of light, each rotation. And then he replaces the light that he has simply spoken into existence, being the light giver. On day 4, he will replace it with the light from the sun, and it will continue to simply have light being coming towards the earth. But he places the sun in the place where the light was coming from, and boom, we've got it. I do not see what the difficulty is there. And again, in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11, he equates the first 3 days and the second 3 days of creation to the days that we have today. They are no different.
And you made an excellent point earlier about, so God, if he wanted to, he could create instantaneously. He can do anything. But he created in 7 days for a reason, because he's giving us the point that it's applicable to us. Work 6 days, rest on one, not work 6,000 or work thousands of days, rest on one. And so that makes a lot of sense. And then, like you said here, I don't see the big issue that apparently this is a big issue that constantly arises, Dr. Grady. So I appreciate it. Here's another one from Tanya. So Tanya is wondering, how is Yom used for 3 days at the crucifixion?
Well, that's because, unfortunately, most Christians were influenced by the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. And the teaching there was that Jesus died on a Friday and rose on a Sunday. Nobody argues with the Sunday resurrection, or the 8th day, meaning the 8th day since he was selected as the lamb on the previous Sunday, which was the 10th day of Nisan that year. But the problem is that this misinterpretation, you have to look at the history. I mean, you really have to understand. Remember that after Constantine and the establishment of Christianity in the Roman world, that they blamed the Jews for the crucifixion. Now, the Jews are not to blame for the crucifixion. First of all, the Romans actually did do it, but this is all part of God's plan. This was, you can't blame any one human for this. This was in fulfillment of God's plan for salvation, correct? That Jesus had to die on the cross. And if you will read, go back in your New Testament a little bit, it says that in Capernaum, they begged him to stay and be their pastor, and that he was safe. But he set his face like a flint to go to Jerusalem, knowing what was going to happen, knowing that he had to die for humanity to have the opportunity to be saved, correct? I mean, so it's wrong to blame the Jews. And in my opinion, it's kind of wrong to blame the Romans, only in the sense that they are simply actors fulfilling the script that God wanted. But once Christianity had been established in the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church, they didn't want to know anything, particularly about the Old Testament or Judaism, because to them, Jews were the bad guys. Okay? Now, I'm making this simplistic because it's good to have it in a simplistic way. But you had to be brain dead to live in Europe and not know that Jews worshipped on Friday night and Saturday, that was Shabbat, the day, quote, the day of rest. But I'd like to redefine that too, if you don't mind. But you just had to be brain dead. And so what happened? Well, since it was said in the scriptures that Jesus had to be taken off the cross, the body and the 2 criminals, because the Sabbath was coming and they had to be taken off the crosses before the night came. And so they decided, erroneously, that Jesus died on Friday afternoon. And then they came up with the concept, well, any part of a day counts as a day. Not true. And so they said, well, there's a little bit of Friday, there's all day Saturday, and a little bit of Sunday, and that makes 3 days. However, first of all, Jesus said he would rise on the 3rd day, not after the 3rd day. Now, I wrote a book on the Feast of the Old Testament where I go over this very thoroughly. If you're interested, that's what it's called, the Feast of the Old Testament. We have it on our website. If a little plug, you can get it either in the physical copy or in the electronic version. But I grew up in the Jewish community. I was never a Jew, but I grew up in the Jewish community. I became mitzvah, which is a friend of the family, treated equally as a Gentile in the Jewish community. I speak with some authority. My book is also the book used by the Messianic Union, that's the Christian Jews in Russia, as their book to teach all of their people on the feast. So I think that I speak with some authority here. People fail to understand that on the third day is a terminology which is an idiomatic expression in Hebrew. It means half a day plus 2, or 2 days plus a half a day. Now, in the case of Jesus, it's 2 days plus a half a day. And I also explain that while Friday night and Saturday are always a Shabbat, always the seventh day on the Jewish calendar of the week, always the day of rest, there are 7 extra Shabbatons that occur each year. And they are very specific. They're the first and last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You have Passover, and then 7 days. There's 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, immediately Hag Hamatzah. And in the middle of Hag Hamatzah, you have first fruits. So there are 3 major feasts that all occur within an 8-day period. The 8-day period is referred to as the Passover time, even though the first day is the Passover. It's the 14th day of Nisan. So let's go legalistically here for a second. Go back to the Exodus. Go back to when God established all these things. You go back to Exodus chapter 12, verse 1. In the spring of the year, God institutes a second calendar for religious events. And he takes the 7th month of the civil calendar, which is the month of Nisan, and he makes it the first month of a brand new calendar for religious events. And if you'll read Exodus 12, starting at verse 1, on the 10th day of that month, having established a religious calendar, a second calendar of 12 months, they were to select a lamb. Then on the 14th, they were to slay the lamb. That's Passover. That night, they will eat unleavened bread. And so that is the 15th, and it goes through the 22nd. But on the 17th day is the day that they will go through the Red Sea. And when they enter the promised land in Joshua chapter 5, it's when they ate of the first fruits. So Jesus often called himself the first fruits offering. Apply that then to the week that Jesus died. He came in on a Sunday, everybody agrees. It was the 10th day of Nisan, and this is when you select the lamb. And so they went from Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, down to Bethlehem. It's only 5 miles. And they would select lambs and bring them back on the 10th. They would inspect the lambs. They picked 2 because they wanted to make sure they had one perfect lamb. But on the 14th, they would slay one of those lambs at exactly 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Now, think with me for a second. Jesus was fulfilling perfectly the law of Moses. He was selected as the lamb on the 10th. That was a Sunday. You slay the lamb on the 14th, which has to be, absolutely has to be Thursday. Because remember, the date changes in the evening, 90 minutes after sunset. The Last Supper occurred on Wednesday night, and it was a mock Seder because it should have been on the 15th. But Jesus had to be dead in his body in the tomb before the 15th. So on Wednesday night, the 14th day of Nisan, he has the Last Supper, as is referred to. In the morning, having had 2 illegal trials, he was sent to be crucified, and he was crucified at 9 a.m., was on the cross for 6 hours, 6 being the number of man. And then he dies at 3 p.m. at exactly the same time the little lamb died on the Temple Mount. And people in the Middle East are buried on the same day they die, almost 100% of the time. And so the tomb already existed. It had been modified, knowing that he would be crucified. They had hours to modify the tomb. And he's placed in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea that afternoon before the sun sets. So his body is placed in the tomb on the 14th, Thursday afternoon. Now, the 15th is the first of 7 Shabbatons. These are called High Holy Days, and I can show you in all 4 Gospels that this is referred to. And so the 15th was an extra Shabbaton, an extra Sabbath. In the year that Jesus died, there were 2 Sabbaths back to back. The 15th, the first day of unleavened bread, was a Sabbaton. Then on Friday night, it becomes the 16th. And Saturday is the 16th, and that is the regular Sabbath. So there are 2 24-hour Sabbaths back to back that year. Now, it only happens every few years. It's not every year that way, because the 10th is not always a Sunday to start with. But the year Jesus died, God had to arrange it where the Sunday he was picked as the Lamb of God was the 10th, the day you picked the lamb in Egypt. He had to die on the 14th because that's when the lamb has to die. It's on the Thursday. His body's in the ground Thursday night and Friday, which was a Shabbaton, an extra Sabbath, a high holy day. Friday night and Saturday on the 16th is a regular Sabbath. And Saturday night, it becomes the 17th. And that is the beginning of the Feast of First Fruits. And before 6 a.m. on Sunday, the 17th day, he will rise out of the tomb. And about 6 a.m., the women will discover the resurrection. So he was in the tomb for 2 24-hour days, plus roughly 12. And so it is easy to take a look at the calendar and the law. And you can clearly see that Jesus was actually in the tomb on the 14th. That's a Thursday. He didn't die on Friday.
Now, that is a great answer right there, Dr. Grady, and an important one as well. How many prophecies of the Old Testament did Jesus fulfill in his ministry, his death, burial, resurrection?
Oh, slightly over 300.
Wow.
But there are still prophecies to be fulfilled.
Right.
In the same way that of the 7 major feasts of the Old Testament, Jesus, and spiritually, we can say, and physically, the first 4 feasts have been physically and supernaturally fulfilled in the past. The second 3 still have to be fulfilled spiritually. And so this deals with his second coming. And there's a clear distinction, for instance, in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus read from the scroll of Isaiah, the chapter 61 verses, he again read only that part of Isaiah 61 that dealt with his first coming. And it's a pretty good thing he did, too, because in Nazareth, if he had continued to read in Isaiah 61, he would have had to bring the kingdom into existence 2,000 years ago, and you and I would never have existed.
Wow. So we've got a write-up here. Let me see. By you, Dr. Grady, Christ is risen indeed, evidence for the resurrection. And so you've, again, like I said earlier, you're an encyclopedia of information, creation, evolution, age of the earth, and evidence for the resurrection. So if I could ask you, since we're kind of on this topic, what are some good lines of evidence or some good reasons to believe in the resurrection? Let's say a skeptic was wondering, Dr. Grady.
Well, first of all, of course, the Bible is accurate history.
Right.
And that is the first place. But we know of at least 9, possibly as many as 10 to 12 historians outside the Bible, secular historians. Flavius Josephus is not the only one. But we know of at least 9 or slightly more reliable historians of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries who talk about Jesus, talk about his life, talk about his crucifixion, talk about his resurrection. And so these accounts should be considered as reliable if you're going to believe them about any of the ancient world. I mean, the life of Jesus is superiorly recorded for us versus Homer. Homer himself, the name could be a myth. The Iliad and the Odyssey and so forth might have been written by somebody else because we only have scant evidence of them. Fortunately, we do have them. But the Bible and other historians of that time, of the 1st, 2nd century, clearly establish it. And I think, and I speak from a personal standpoint, when I became a Christian, the piece of evidence out of everything, and I had read the outside histories, I'd read the Bible for the first time, and so on. But the single most outstanding piece of evidence for me was that over 500 people were willing to be crucified and would not recant that they had seen him after the resurrection. Now, that is clearly established in historical records. No one will intentionally die to support a lie. So that means that if over 500 people were willing to die and not recant that they had seen him after the resurrection, this is tremendous evidence that the resurrection actually did occur.
That truly is tremendous evidence, Dr. Grady. And this is what I love about our shows together, our informal shows together. You never know what topics we're going to touch on, what trails we're going to go down, brother. And so that'll make a good clip for our channel. Now, I'm curious. A lot of skeptics or critics, they would respond by saying, okay, what about those in other religions like Islam? A lot of them will die for their faith. But we know that their faith is wrong in many ways. And so how is that any different than these witnesses going about and dying in many cases for their faith?
Well, first of all, there's no recorded resurrection of Muhammad.
Right.
There's no account of a resurrection, again, dealing with Hinduism or any other religion in the world. Now, there were Greek philosophies that did include resurrection as a concept, but the body of Muhammad is still there, at least as far as we know. They got a black cube there. They say his body's there, but they make no claim to him being resurrected because he was the prophet of God according to their religion, but he was not a savior. Now, it is easy to show that can only be one true religion, in spite of the claims of any and all of them. And of course, every one of them will claim they're the right one. What we have to do is look at the claims. And it is easy to disprove Islam. It's easy to disprove Hinduism and so forth, because there's obviously false arguments. As a matter of fact, on my website, I have an article. Islam has been disproven theologically by thousands of authors. I'm not going to try to reinvent the wheel. So what I did was I wrote an article disproving it scientifically. And this comes to the answer to your question. There can only be one true religion. And if we have the account of that creation from that creator, whoever it might be, then he would know what he did and he would record it accurately, correct? I mean, this is just logical. And there would be no errors. And that's why I say you read the Bible as inerrant, not literally. But and you have to remember there are 14 different accepted Qurans, whereas there's only one Bible. Now, there are different translations of the Bible, yes, but we have only one Bible. We have the established Old Testament Hebrew and Aramaic. We have established the books of the New Testament by canon law. And so there's no question about that. The only differences would be in interpretations or paraphrases or whatever. But in Islam, there are 14 accepted Qurans, 7 accepted with an A and a B version both, and done by their best scholars, according to them. But I went through the Qurans and showed there are errors in medicine and there are errors of science. Well, obviously, if they were written by the one true creator God, he would know what he would have done and he would have recorded it accurately. But when you find these massive numbers of errors, it simply proves that it's not a valid document. And you do the same thing with any of these other religions. There's only one true religion, and there's roughly 1,000 verses of the Bible which deal with, maybe only claim to be creator, but there are many actual laws and scientific principles. Almost every area of science, as a matter of fact, is mentioned, for instance, in the book of Job. But every scientific statement, every mathematical statement in the Bible is correct.
Excellent response, Dr. Grady. It looks like we've got your article, I think, that you're referring to here. Is Islam a scientifically valid religion? The answer is no.
And
And
the
so
answer is no.
you've got a lot on your website in terms of articles, mini videos, and so on. So I recommend people check that out.
We have 100 articles, and we have over 400 free videos. They're shorts. They're shorts. 1 minute, 5 minute, 10 minute. And then, of course, we have our bookstore with full-length videos, too. But I've told people, and I will say it again, if you have insomnia, go to our website, go to the video section, takes you to our YouTube channel, and just start playing them. And after 5 or 10, you're out.
You get the best sleep of your life.
Actually, we have one. The newest is always the first to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
And as they automatically play, and then they get older and older as you go down. But there's over 400 of them. But if you go back 2 or 3 of the most current, we've had over 700 views of that one, for instance, just recently. So if you go to creationworldview.org, we have, again, the free articles. Almost all of them are at the popular level. Now, we have a small section with just a few technical articles clearly labeled, but anybody with even a 5th, 6th grade education or up can read the other 100.
That's great. I've got those links here, not only in the live chat for those watching, but also in the description box.
Thank you.
And so I appreciate how thorough this has been so far. And I think we're moving along smoothly in the sense that we've discussed the age of the earth. We've countered many of the arguments or challenges that old earth creationists and theistic evolutionists would put forth. You've shown why Christianity is the one true religion. You've given evidence for the resurrection. And so one last question or topic before we get into some of these lines of evidence for evolution, some of the so-called best lines of evidence for why we're all related through common ancestry. I'd like to ask you about the flood, as the flood is an incredibly important event, of course, in our history and in the Bible. And so there are many, again, in the old earth and theistic evolutionist camps, Dr. Grady, and they would argue this. And so I'm wondering what a good response to this argument would be. And so they say the flood was universal to humanity and the animals associated with them, but it was not global. It was not a global flood. Universal, yes, but only to where humans were at the time. One passage they look to is 2 Peter 2, where it talks about the world of the ungodly. They are the ones flooded. And so they don't believe Peter is referring to the entire planet, but is referring to that entire region of the earth where humans lived at the time, Dr. Grady.
Well, again, it's an absurd argument, and they simply haven't thought it through. I would suggest 2 Peter chapter 3, where Peter says that the earth that then was cataclysmically destroyed. That's the word he uses in the Greek, cataclysmically destroyed. But the idea that the flood was only where humanity was is again totally erroneous. Go to day 3 of the week of creation, Genesis chapter 1. God caused the dry land to rise up out of the water, and he separated the dry land from the water. And the concept of Pangea, often used by evolutionists talking about a supercontinent 200 million supposed years ago that broke apart and moved the continents where they are today, does not belong to the evolutionists. The concept of Pangea belongs to us. Because at the end of day 3, if you had looked at the Earth from a satellite, 40% of the Earth's surface was dry land, almost 100% of it in one place. Now, we do know, because there's the physical evidence to prove it, that there were some islands. Today they're called gyos, but these are underwater, flat top mountains with beaches around the edges and sandy beaches but around the edges, coral reefs, the kind of coral that only grows within 300 feet of the surface of the ocean because they do require sunlight. But today are roughly 5,000 feet below sea level, 1 mile. And this is, of course, part of what we do in our narration of what really happened at the time of the flood. Then a mile of water came up from below. There are many evidences for that. Dual continental shelves in the Indian Ocean from India to Australia. Dual continental shelves from the Gulf of Alaska to Kamchatka, from Kamchatka past Japan all the way to Vietnam, showing the ocean floor dropped a mile at the time of the flood. And these were islands at the time of creation. And when a mile of water came out from below, then they sank down 1 mile, and that's why there's a mile of water on top. But there were some islands. That's obvious. We have the physical evidence. But I want to stress, at the end of day 3, 40% of the Earth's surface would have been dry land. Today, it's 30% dry land, and the continents have separated because at the time of the flood, that's when they broke apart. Pangea broke apart. That's only 4,350 or so years ago. And that the continents moved rapidly because they were floating on a layer of water 1 mile deep initially. And so, first of all, humans occupied all of Pangea. So the flood was not merely universal with humanity, it was total over the earth. I would stress that when we take a look at Genesis chapter 7, 8, 9, God says, I'm going to wipe out all life that has nefesh. That's not just humans, but it is all humans, except the 8 on the ark. But it would also include the animals that have nefesh, which is cats, dogs, and dinosaurs. And chapter 9, he says, I did wipe out all the flesh that has nefesh, except for the animals and the 8 people that were in the ark. Now, this is the animals that live on dry land, not the fish. The millions, billions of them died during the flood. It does not apply to the things that live in the ocean. But in Genesis chapters 7 and 8, the water rose to at least 21.5 feet above the highest piece of land before the flood occurred. We go to Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9. That's the chronology of the flood. Verse 5, God sends a worldwide flood. Verse 6, the water was above the mountains. Not up to the top, but above. Verse 7, the waters go away. Verse 8, only after the waters go away do the mountains that we know today rise up and the valleys sink down. In verse 9, God promises he'll never again flood the earth with water. Again, 2 Peter chapter 3, the earth was cataclysmically covered. So this is not a local flood. This is not merely a flood where people live, because before the flood, in what was Pangea, people lived in all of the areas. So it's a totally false argument, and they're simply not thinking through what the scripture actually says.
That's right. That's an excellent answer. The Bible is very clear. It says all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. I mean, it can't get any more clear than that.
Chapter 9, I will, and I did. Now, either he did or he didn't, but he says he did.
Well, I think you nailed it. I think you had the perfect rebuttal there at the beginning, where these old earth creationists, they'll argue from 2 Peter 2, I think it is, where they say the world of the ungodly. But wait a minute, if you keep reading, and you pointed it out, go to 2 Peter 3, the very next chapter, where Peter brings up the flood again.
Yep.
And there he's contrasting the pre-flood world, which was destroyed by water. And then he even compares it to the world in the future being judged by fire. Is that judgment by fire going to be local, Dr. Grady?
Hardly. But again, the stipulation of Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9, verse 9, I'll never flood the earth again. 2 Peter, there's not going to be another flood of the earth, but there will be a judgment by fire of the whole earth.
Right.
And forgive me, but a loose concept, again, I'd like to deal with the conceptual constructs. Fire is used for sanitation, and there's going to be a fire in judgment coming, in which God is going to sterilize the universe from the effects of human sin. But there's not going to be another worldwide flood.
It's kind of confusing to me how they can just say, well, all of humanity is just situated in this small region, so only that region's flooded. But yet after the flood, we know that the world is repopulated by Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their 3 wives. And so they'd have to argue that there were nobody outside of that region anywhere in the planet for us to all come from those 3 couples.
Well, and why build an ark if it's a local flood? I mean, okay, we've had thousands of local floods. Millions of animals have died in them. They didn't cover the whole earth. But God says that there's this one flood that did. And what is so hard to accept from that? You know, this is straining in a gnat and swallowing in a camel.
That's right. That's right, Dr. Grady. Okay, my next question to you then, and again, I appreciate you being so thorough. That's a great response to their arguments from the local flood theory. And so I think that was adequately dismantled. What are some of your favorite or just the best scientific lines of evidence for young Earth creation in general, Dr. Grady?
Well, I would say there's at least 15 different categories of evidence. Now, of course, the geochronometers are the ones that I love the most personally, which are simply scientific arguments for a young Earth, young solar system, young galaxy, young universe. And it doesn't matter where you start. Okay, heat content of the Earth, heat content of the moon's recession rate from the Earth, rotation of the sun, too much dust in the solar system, the Poynting Robertson effect. Lumpy rings around planets. The rings are not smooth. They ought to be if they're old, but they're lumpy. They're still having particles broken apart, but because they're not in synchronous orbit, the rings are actually being destroyed rather rapidly. The inner rings are falling into the planets. They go around and are being thrown away outwards, escaping the gravitational pull of their planets. The 4 gas giants all have rings. Many people don't realize that. But the rings are definitely young. When we got to Uranus, we found that there's at least 2 rings that will probably not even exist in the next 100 years. We found, of course, Pluto has young features, and we go everywhere. I mean, bar and spiral galaxies. So to me, the geochronometers are just the single best one. But there are also many others. One of them would be demographics. Again, I would beg everybody to just do the math, or as they say in England, let's do the maths. I've been there many times. I love it, imitating them. I love the people there. They speak real English, you know. Well, we don't speak real English, you know, you and I.
Right. It's true.
You speak Canadian, I speak North American. But just the simple demographics. You can get 8 billion people alive on Earth with one pair, starting just with one pair of humans 4,500 years ago, and do the math. How long is a generation? Now, in the Bible, it does define a generation as several different numbers. Today, you're lucky if a generation is 20 years. I suspect you may at least know a grandmother who became a grandmother before her 40th birthday. Maybe your own, I don't know. But you know, when we think about time and generations, the Bible talks about 30, 35, 40, etc. According to evolutionary anthropologists, humans have been recognizable as humans for at least 500,000 years or 1 million, depending upon who you talk to. Now, how many generations would occur? And let's be generous. Let's say every 40 years you get a generation, because if you use every 20, it just, gets almost absurd. But let's say generation's 40. How many generations would there be in 1 million years?
A lot.
Oh, come on, Donny. You can do the math on this one, can't you?
Let me get out my calculator, brother. My Canadian calculator. The best kind.
So. But you're looking at, even being conservative, 50,000 generations.
Right.
And if you get more realistic, it makes it 100,000 generations. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. Where are the artifacts? where are the tools? Where are the skeletons? Tests have been done that indicate that without any form of preservation, and again, we've never had 100,000 years, we've never had 1,000,000 years to test this sort of thing out. But in terms of lab results of aging, a skeleton simply placed in the ground without any preservation, 6 feet down, and just leave it there. Even the bones would dissolve in 100,000 years, and yet they say, oh, these bones are 3 million years old. These pre-ape, pre-human bones, 1,000,000 years old. Lucy, 3.2 million years old, and the dinosaurs, 65 to 200 million years old, and so forth. But we have found soft tissue in materials that are supposedly all the way back to 500 million years. Absolutely impossible. But in 1,000,000 years, if we simply looked for just the artifacts, much less the bodies, you would have to have a machete just to walk from the house to the yard through the debris left by humans. And so often the proof in science is, number one, what's there, of course, but the greater proof in science is what's not there. And they cannot explain what's not there. We only find enough evidence for a few thousand years.
That's right. That right there is an excellent answer, because you can pick your species, quote unquote, in the evolutionary model and then see that it simply doesn't fit, like you were saying. I mean, you could take just Homo erectus. According to the evolutionary model, Homo erectus lived on the globe for 1,000,000+ years. And so there's a lot of generations. There's a lot of dead bodies, billions of dead bodies. Where are they all? Like you said, Dr. Grady.
Why do we find so few?
Right.
Pompeii is a special case where a volcano preserved, hundreds and hundreds of people for us, and art and so forth, and tools. But that's a special case scenario of volcanic eruption. But if we just take a look at farmers, hunter-gatherers, etc., living for hundreds and hundreds of generations, we ought to find tools and bodies and buildings and so forth all over the place. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but they just found a Stonehenge-like structure underwater, 40 feet down in Lake Michigan.
Wow.
It looks very similar to Stonehenge in England, standing stone, circular, and so forth. Obviously, this is a result of the worldwide flood. This is obviously at the end of the one ice age that followed the flood, where people were building near water because, as you know, 80% of the Earth's population always lives within 100 or 200 miles of the ocean. And during the ice age, when the water went down to 300 feet in the oceans, they were building too close. I mean, the tsunami back in 2004 in Indonesia revealed buildings off the coast of India that they didn't even know about. The story of Atlantis, while I think the story is somewhat mythological, and that there is a miscopying of what was written by the original author, we have found structures off the west coast of Spain that are underwater. Now we just found this entire Stonehenge-like structure in the bottom of Lake Michigan. And it simply shows that when the ice melted back at the end of the ice age, the water rose 200 or 300 feet. That's right. And buried the structures that they had built during, give or take, 300 years of time, and that they simply had to move upland to get away from the water and rebuild new cities, new fishing villages, etc. But these buried cities all over the world, buried by water, are simply proof that the ice age water was 200-300 feet lower during the middle of the ice age, and that when it melted back to where the ice caps are today, the water rose 200-300 feet. And so those are structures which speak of a young Earth and speak of what happened immediately after the ice age that ended. The flood is about 4,350 years ago, give or take a little, or about 2350 BC. And the ice age only lasted about 700 years. And it's due to the events that started the flood and followed. These are naturally occurring events that God put in place with his foreknowledge, but that actually did occur, and that again we can actually prove this by the land bridges from Southeast Asia to Australia, the land bridges from what some people call Siberia. It's not. It's the Russian Far East to Alaska, and that these land bridges were exposed during that one ice age when the water was lower, and people were building lower because they didn't know the water was going to come back up. And so here's just another piece of evidence for that.
Right. So these interesting stories about these ancient, highly sophisticated cities and civilizations like Atlantis, do you believe that the best explanation lies within the young earth creation model? Because like you said, after the flood, you throw all this water into the ice caps, lowers the sea levels, then eventually those start to melt back, and then these cities that people built over the course of hundreds of years, they're now flooded, these local floods, and destroyed.
And if you take a look, for instance, at the structures that have been found underwater on the west coast of Spain, there's a miscopying of the ancient writing as to where it was located. Because if you read the ancient writing, it would locate it out in the middle of the Atlantic, which is where Atlantis comes from.
Right.
But it's very obvious. We know what's on the bottom of the ocean out there, and there's obviously no Atlantis in the bottom of the Atlantic. And I mean, we know exactly what the features are on the bottom of the Atlantic. But it's that copying error. If you take 5,000 and you read it, but if you take off a zero, it's only 500, right?
Right.
Or 1/10 the distance. And in fact, the west coast of Spain would be just like that in the ancient writings. So there's a copying error. They added a zero that doesn't belong there. But we have all of these other buildings that we have found. There's human structure and so forth off the coast of Japan underwater. I think we need to be careful, of course. But there's been pavement found near the Bahamas that is now under shallow water. We find all of these things, and we know that recent geological movements have caused some land to rise up. For instance, I'm Scottish. I've been to Loch Ness. There's no monster there, forget it. But we also know that that area of Scotland rose about 400 feet of elevation in the last few centuries. And we know that Loch Ness, meaning lake in Gaelic, was at one time a fjord. And so you do get local subsidence and local rising of lands that can change the topography. And when it was a fjord, there were some kind of large marine reptile, plesiosaur, elasmosaur, chronosaur, going up and down the fjord that was seen by people. And as the land rose and cut the fjord off and made it a lake, they probably got out before it happened. But even if they were trapped, they didn't survive. And there's no monster there today. But that doesn't mean there wasn't one. Doesn't mean that it wasn't seen. Myth always starts in reality.
Right. And it's hard to believe that, and correct me if I'm wrong, hundreds and hundreds of these stories and accounts and people witnessing these creatures over time, it's hard to believe that they're all mistaken or all seeing the wrong thing.
Just Loch Ness, I think the number is somewhere around 11,000.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But I've been there and nothing there now.
Right. Right. Well, like you said, these myths, quote unquote, they start with reality, right? They start with some kind of truth.
But you're up in Canada. And are you familiar with a similar monster to the Loch Ness monster called Champy?
Yep. Lake Champlain.
Lake Champlain. But Lake Champlain was at one time open to the Atlantic. It was basically I don't know whether we would exactly call it a fjord, but we do know that it connected to the St. Lawrence network. And so creatures could have come up the St. Lawrence and been there. How do you explain that in the middle of the United States, I'm talking about our Midwest area, we have found 300 Viking mooring stones, and they're roughly 200 to 300 feet above current water levels?
Interesting.
We know that there was a lake, a very large lake, not just the Great Lake, but a very large lake. And you're familiar with the Madras Fault?
Mm-hmm. It wasn't my fault, though.
No, me neither. But think about it for a second. The Mississippi crosses the New Madras Fault. Now, south of the New Madras Fault, the Mississippi meanders. And evolutionists will claim this is an old river. As a matter of fact, they claim the Mississippi is 2 million years old. Absolutely absurd, but they claim it. But did you notice that the Mississippi is actually pretty straight north of the New Madras Fault when it goes up in towards Wisconsin and so forth? I can't prove it, but I think it's a good speculation that there was a dam that held a really big lake that finally breached during an earthquake on the New Madras Fault, and that big lake drained very quickly. And this is why the Mississippi is straight north of there, but meanders south of there. And the Vikings, we have found mooring stones in the Midwest. And of course, they portaged their longboats. We have recovered letters that were sent by Viking leaders. And you know, of course, the Vikings in Iceland and Greenland, but also Newfoundland, right? I mean, Newfoundland. We know that there were Viking villages there, but they also went up the St. Lawrence. They went up the Great Lakes. They portaged their longboats and actually came down the Mississippi and some of the tributaries, because we have the writings, we have rune stones, we have the mooring stones. Geological features change rapidly. They do not change slowly and gradually as evolutionists claim. And a good student of history would be able to put that together.
Very interesting points there, just overall on this topic. And so I'm wondering your thoughts on, because some of these ancient cities that you referred to that have essentially, a lot of these cities in the post-flood world that have been buried due to these local floods, like Atlantis or El Dorado, you hear these stories or these depictions, right? You see these movies where these people were highly sophisticated, highly intelligent.
Never get your education from Hollywood, Donny. I keep telling you
that. Yeah, exactly. If Hollywood's portraying your idea, your doctrine, it's probably wrong. So, yeah. Do you think there's any
example?
So, do you think there's a little bit of truth in the sense that after the flood, you have Noah's family, they reproduce, and they have all this knowledge that's accumulated, and so maybe they were a little more advanced at that time before they were flooded? Or I guess my question is, do you think there's any truth at all to what we see there?
Absolutely, that humans have had knowledge, because Adam and Eve were pre-programmed minds. They had perfect human minds, pre-programmed by God to start with. And they were doing things, including metallurgy, surveying, mathematics, construction of villages and cities. They were doing all this. They had copper, iron, steel before the flood. You know, you reach 8 generations to Tubal Cain and so forth, and they were smelting ores. They had a lot of knowledge. And of course, what does happen is knowledge actually gets lost over time and then rediscovered. Because after the flood, we have millions and millions of men and women working and acquiring knowledge and adding back up again. But they had knowledge that we still don't have. Think about it, building the pyramids, the obelisks that were built after the flood by the Egyptians, but the pyramids of Egypt would be also equal to the pyramids in China, India, of course, Egypt, but also in South America, because pyramids, squares, rounds, rectangles are common known geographic and geometric symbols, and this is what they were building. They had incredible knowledge of astronomy. They were very good astronomers. But we are finding thousands of new cities in the jungles of South America using lasers. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what they were building in South America. But we also know that they were building massive structures, and of course, the Great Wall of China. But they were building massive structures and moving objects. There is one stone in the western wall of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah that is estimated to weigh 70 tons.
Wow.
And it is not a cube. Now, if it was a cube, you can understand how they might be able to move a cube without breaking it. But this is a very long rectangle, and it's stone. And it's Jerusalem stone. It is a good building stone because it's soft enough to be worked with, but it's very durable over time. But it does wear. And if it's 70 foot long, how did they move it? Because it should have flexed and cracked, but it's not. So they knew how to do things that we couldn't do today with diesel engines and pulleys.
Well, according to evolution, with enough time and mutations and work, you can take fish to fishermen. So maybe with enough time and working out, Dr. Grady, we'll be able to lift 17 tons one day. Is that possible?
70 tons.
70 tons. Okay. Well, then in that case. So right there, more fascinating points, Dr. Grady.
Obelisks that, again, made in Egypt and other places that you wonder how. Now, I think we have a pretty good idea on actually how they did set them upright. But set them upright without cracking is another question.
Well, you hear, and this is why the Bible has all the answers, brother, because you hear these theories like ancient alien theories, which I was sucked into years and years ago before I became a Christian, because you hear Stonehenge and these pyramids and all of these sophisticated structures that some in the naturalist camp or those that are not Christian, they'll say, well, there's no way humans could have built these. And so aliens must have visited us and helped with these structures.
I remember Donegan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, it's as bogus could possibly be. First of all, just from a biblical standpoint, Psalm 115 says this is the only place that there are people, the only thing made in the image of God.
That's right.
Jesus came here and died once for all, which is totally inclusive. But from a scientific standpoint, I think people forget. Scientifically, until we actually find it, it doesn't exist. You can make all the claims about aliens and everything else you want to, but the people who have, quote unquote, seen these things, what are they actually seeing? Well, they're seeing demonic activity.
Right.
If God's angels can take the form of humans, and they're always men, they're never any women, but always in the form of men, in order not to be monstrous, then satanic fallen angels can take the form of alien creatures in order to be mysterious or again, terrifying, or an object like a UFO, and do things because they're supernatural beings that would not be possible in the natural. People forget because they're, how should we say this? They are influenced, indoctrinated by sci-fi movies such as Star Wars and Star Trek and all those, that you can fly, across the galaxies and from one part of the universe, the Delta Quadrant, to try to get back to the Alpha Quadrant.
Right.
But there are some very serious limitations. It takes 4.3 years to get to the closest star outside of our solar system at the speed of light. Fastest thing we can build currently, it would take 50,000 years to get there. But let's say we could go at warp 5, 6, whatever. And they say, well, that's the answer. We just get bigger, better engines and we fly at faster and faster speeds. But of course, the laws of relativity, both special and general, would give you some very serious problems with that. There is another problem that people forget. The idea we're going to zoom from this solar system to another solar system and so forth. It's great science fiction. I like good science fiction. But they forget it's not going to happen. The physics of these movies doesn't work in reality. And I point this out to people sometimes. What is the single factor is going to prevent us from, getting in some vessel we construct with warp engines, and but what is the single biggest constraint to that kind of travel? Can you figure it out?
The biggest constraint to that kind of travel that we see in Star Trek and Star Wars?
Well, or even the concept. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have. Now, mind you, the physics of those movies don't work.
Right.
But uh, what's the single biggest constraint in us even ever doing something of that nature?
Oh, just the advances that would be necessary to build those structures. I don't think they're possible. I mean, I'm not sure, Dr. Grady. What you give me the answer? Gravity. I'll throw that out there.
So gravity exists everywhere. It's just microgravity between galaxies, or solar systems, whatever. It isn't water. It isn't oxygen. Doesn't necessarily have to be fuel, because we can get fuel on the way. No, the single biggest constraint is called friction.
Okay. We've got people in the chat saying mass and fuel. So people are enjoying this. They're giving their answers, but friction is the
laws of again, special and general relativity. Mass becomes a problem because as you accelerate the speed of light, mass increases, length shortens, time comes to a stop, and all, and those would be good answers. But the one single thing that absolutely says we'll never do it is friction. People forget. They think that space is a vacuum. And yes, it comes very close, but space is not a true vacuum. There's gas molecules and dust particles. Now, they might be 3 feet apart, 6 feet apart. I don't care if they're a mile apart. The problem is friction, because if an object is flying through space, you're going to hit things. And I don't mean the sun. I'm simply talking about the fact that friction. Have you ever been to a space museum, such as the Smithsonian, or down here? We have several space museums here in the areas of the Cape, near where I live. I don't know if there's a space museum in Canada, but I suspect there's something. You've had Canadian astronauts. But have you ever taken a look at any of these things that have been in space and then come back down and put in a museum? For instance, the Mercury capsule. We have a Mercury capsule, and they did not touch it up. They simply, as is, put it in the museum so everybody could see what it was like after it came back, right? Look at the windows. Now, this is thick, heavy glass, and you can see etched scratches on the glass because, 250 miles up, it's hitting stuff. Well, if you're going to travel light years, that much distance, that's a light year, roughly 5.8 trillion miles, and you're going to do it year after year for a while, the erosion would actually eat through the spaceship.
Wow. Well, I guess that's why they call it science fiction, which, like you, I like a good science fiction story, a good science fiction movie, but a lot in the naturalist camp, they leave out they forget the fiction aspect of it. Is that right, Dr. Grady?
And good science fiction is often predictive of the future, such as Jules Verne. His story of the Nautilus was very, very predictive. Now, his shot to the moon wasn't as predictive in method, but we did eventually go to the moon, but his story of the Nautilus was terrific in terms of the prophetic nature of the science fiction. But you cannot take a gun and shoot a body with this beam and have it disappear. That would, again, defy the laws of physics. You might kill somebody, but they aren't going to disappear. They're not going to literally become nothing. Maybe a pile of ash, but there's going to be stuff left over.
So it sounds like contrary. I know you've spoken on this, contrary to what those in the evolutionary community, evolutionist camp, say that, biological organisms, humans in general, are getting better, bigger, stronger, faster, smarter. Seems to be the opposite of that. Now, we've accumulated knowledge, sure, but where'd that knowledge come from?
Humans are the only creature that can acquire knowledge and accumulate it over generations. Lions don't do that. Elephants don't do that. Dogs can learn tricks while they're alive, but they don't pass it on to the next generation. And so humans are the only creature that can learn, acquire knowledge, pass it on, and add to it in generations. So today we know more than they may have known at, before the flood. But that's only because of millions and millions of man and woman hours accumulating knowledge, passing it on to others, and finding out that much of their knowledge was not true. 1668, Reddy proved that life did not spontaneously come out of a pile of rotting rags, or life didn't spontaneously generate.
That's right.
And of course, Pasteur put the cork on that bottle. But life only comes from life and only reproduces after its own kind. That's a scientifically proven principle. Life does not spontaneously generate. For the complexity of life to come into existence, you have to have a greater intelligence outside. There's many things, but simply because we know more now than we knew 300 years ago, individually, we are not as intelligent. We have, of course, our bodies are deteriorating. That's genetic entropy. We've talked about that before.
Yeah.
We're not getting bigger, better, faster, smarter. We're getting smaller, slower, and dumber. And that's simply the truth. That's the scientific reality of it. And if it kept going, the humanity would cease to exist, because we would eventually lose so much genetic information, generation to generation, that we would become sterile and extinct. So we are not getting bigger, better, faster, smarter. And we know that all life forms that we find today, if we can find it a similar thing in the fossil record, they're always bigger in the past than they are today. This is the thing that just amazes me. If you can find a creature alive today and it's representative in the fossil record, number one, they're the same in appearance, but in the past they will be greater in size.
Right. Now,
so things are going downhill, not uphill, and that totally contradicts the evolutionary view.
Well, I like that you pointed that out. It completely wrecks and contradicts the evolutionary view. And when you look to the fossil record, like you said, we see these extant creatures today in bigger forms. And so the evolutionary community, or taxonomists, Dr. Grady, they'll give these animals different names. Like, let's compare the great white shark today and the megalodon in the fossil record. Is that not just a really big shark, though?
Well, how about how about when you take a look at the size differences in other creatures too?
Mm-hmm.
Things like, think of armadillos. Do you have armadillos in Canada? I mean, I think it might be too cold, but do you have them up there?
I've never seen one.
Okay. I think it's too cold for you to have armadillos. But I mean, armadillos, they're only this big today.
Right.
Of course, they used to be the size of a VW bug.
Yeah.
Cockroaches here in Florida, we still have them up to 2.5 inches long. But they used to be over 6 inches.
Wow.
The what's referred to as the Irish elk, with horns 10 foot across. We were actually able to get some DNA material out of museums from the last ones that only died a few hundred years ago. And they're not elk. They're actually a form of red deer. But it doesn't really matter what we look at. Everything that we can identify today and find in the fossil record in the past, everything was bigger and getting smaller now.
And so species and creatures are not evolving. large scale evolution is not happening. What we see is devolution. We see things are going downhill.
We need to mark our terms here. We do see what is called macro evolution. They want to label it. We do not see that happening. We do see microevolution happening.
Right.
But microevolution is simply change in the frequency of alleles in a gene pool. It's lateral adaptation. It has limits because of the laws of genetics. So we only see changes within the kind. We never see the macroevolution of one kind becoming another kind. And so, again, observation and the laws of genetics disprove evolution. It really doesn't matter where you look. But to me, entropy is the one word that destroys evolution from the standpoint of physics and the physical realm.
That's right.
Genetic entropy applied to genetics of all creatures proves that life is going downhill. Extinction has occurred. We don't see any new kinds coming along, but we see kinds that have existed becoming extinct. Now, every year we're discovering something in the area of about 5,000 creatures. We discover them, but not because they're evolving into existence. It's simply because we didn't have the people to go out and find them. But They were there all along. We're just finding them and revealing them to the public. And that's a rather alarming rate. But what are evolutionists really alarmed by? Not that we're finding new ones, which were always there. We just discovered them. They're worried about the extinction of them. Well, if they really believed in the evolutionary theory, then they would not be worried about extinction. They wouldn't be trying to preserve larger and larger amounts of land or whatever to preserve these quote unquote precious types. They would be quite happy with extinction because supposedly new, bigger, better, faster forms would be evolving into existence to replace the inferior ones that have become extinct. And yet we see around the world that they are absolutely terrified by the extinction of kinds today.
Those are some great points. So prominent evolutionary scientists, Dr. Grady, like Richard Dawkins, they'll say, sure, we see these microevolutionary variations, microevolution happens. All macroevolution is, he'll say this to creationists, is microevolution over lots of time.
I know. The Darwinian view of slow and gradual. But you've also got evolutionists that are punctuationists, like Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge,
right,
and others. Goldsmith's, hopeful monster. Evolution is not a monolithic religion. It's a religion, but it's not monolithic, and there are many different denominations. But again, this is not true, and it's easily disproven. Again, we even sell a book. I didn't write it, but we even sell a book showing hundreds and hundreds of photographs of things that are alive today: plants, animals, insects, sea life, and fossils of the exact same creature.
Right.
Which proves that there's been no change, that they did not change over long periods of time. I have a picture of a fossil ginkgo leaf from North Dakota and a live ginkgo leaf today. And that's supposed to be one of the first true tree species, a very unique tree with fan-shaped leaves. And according to evolutionists, there's 150 million years between the two, and yet they're identical in shape. Not size, but in shape. And the same thing is true. I don't care what it is. If you find it alive today and you find it in the fossil record, there's no change, which proves that things do not change over millions and billions of supposed years, that things are static. And that is a proof of creation. It refutes evolution because we don't know how many kinds, and that's the word in the Bible, we don't know how many kinds God created. We do recognize roughly 3 million today, but there could be 10 million. At the beginning because of extinction. But we really don't know how many. But think about it logically. If creation is true, God created a certain number of kind. And let's say for sake of number 5 million. once they were created, you would have only two choices. Either they would continue to reproduce and continue to be seen today, or if any of them became extinct, we would find less and less kinds. If evolution were true, whether it's the tree of life or the bushes of life, we would expect more and more new kinds coming along. That we didn't start with just a certain number and either maintain it or lose it. That new kinds would be coming along, and they wouldn't be worried about kinds becoming extinct. And so the fact that we see extinction today is a proof of creation. And again, it reviews the evolutionary concepts.
Amen. So in light of everything you're saying here, especially with the living fossils, in the fossil record, we find stasis, we find sudden appearance, extinction. We don't find any real large scale evolution. Is that right, Dr. Grady?
Correct. I mean, and this is why the punctuationists like Gould and Eldridge use the word equilibrium, punctuated equilibria, or equilibrium, that there was long periods of time with no change, and then a rapid 2, 3, 4 generational burst of evolution, and then again stasis or equilibrium. That is totally different than the micro version of Darwin and Dawkins. But neither one of them is supported in the fossil record. Neither one of them is supported by science. It is simply a construct, band-aids put on the evidence. And today, evolutionists are not using science to try to defend evolution. Today, they're using the legal method. They show you pictures of creatures, fossils or alive. They line them up by size and shape, a totally erroneous method of proof. We've talked about that. The proof by ranking is no proof of anything. But they do this, and then they say, here's the evidence, and this is our interpretation of that evidence. And they go before the jury, and they try to use stage magic to convince the jury that they're right. And so today, what is the creationist doing? Well, the creationist is doing good science. But we also have a legal method of proof because we have the exact same evidence. There's no difference in the evidence. Creationists and evolutionists have the exact same evidence. What we do have is two different interpretations. And of course, the question being, which is the better interpretation? But when we go before a jury and we show the evidence and we show our interpretation of that evidence, we have a witness and they don't.
That's exactly right, Dr. Grady, my brother. That's a fantastic debunking of evolution. And with that, again, that is another 2 hours together, Dr. Grady. And I am already looking forward to our next discussion together because I've just got about another 5,000 questions for you, Dr. Grady. So that's it. That's it. And I love how comprehensive your answers are because then it brings to mind several novel questions that I want to ask you. So I appreciate your.
When you have been a teacher of evolution, as I once was, and now you're a creationist, you've been on both sides. And when you do that, you're a formidable opponent.
That is right. That's why we love having you here. You've seen both sides. You're on the creationist side now, but you know how the evolutionists think. You know their approach. You know their arguments, and so you know how to engage those. Dr. Grady, I want to hand it over to you. Did you have any final words, final thoughts, anything you'd like to leave our audience with here tonight?
I always like to challenge anybody that's watching to, again, be a good scientist. And when I say that, a good scientist seeks the truth. And so take a look at the evidence, take a look at the interpretations, and then decide for yourself which of the two you will accept. And I would say that when you take a look at all of the natural laws, the natural processes, and the physical evidence, the much better interpretation is a young creation that came into existence all at the same time in 1 week of 7 days, 6 days of active creation, and 1 day of rest. But maybe, Donnie, next time we can talk about what that word rest in the Bible actually means, because it does not mean to stop working. It means to work just as hard.
Yes, I think that's a great topic. for our next program together. So I know as you are a fan favorite, I know the audience is already looking forward to having you back as well. We've had new viewers, new guests here in the live chat, and they've had a lot of positive feedback over today's program. So I did want to let them know that if you go to our official website, standfortruthministries.com, go to the guest section, look for Dr. Grady McMurtry, and you'll find all of his previous programs there, except for this one, but we'll get that one there. So you got hours of content with Dr. Grady answering these important questions.
Again, you get the Creation Worldview, all one string, .org. And we have over 100 articles. We have over 450 free videos, and we also have a bookstore too. But we have lots of free material. Feel free to research it.
Take advantage. I've got your ministry channel here, Dr. Grady, Creation Worldview Ministry. So go over there and subscribe, take advantage. And then here is your website for people to enjoy. Okay, Dr. Grady, as always, I appreciate your time, brother. You are a true blessing to this ministry. So God bless you. And to the audience, God bless you as well. I appreciate all the feedback, the interaction. We also appreciate our critics here that send in their objections and challenges. And so I hope this was edifying to everybody. With that, Standing for Truth is out. God bless all.